Shaka Hislop with another of our podcasts. I'm delighted to be joined today by Anita Asante.
This is 25 for 25, a show races in the Red Card podcast. Make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Anita, what a career it's been. You've given me a lot to try to remember. So permit me to read this off. 71 caps for England. Started out with Arsenal in their academy. In English football, you played for Arsenal, Chelsea, Villa. You've also played in the US. You've played in Sweden. Back coaching. I guess happy retirement, if that's such a thing, given that you jumped straight into coaching. Thanks for joining me. It really is a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to join you, Shaka, and thank you so much for that amazing intro.
It's been some career. It really has. So let's start. I guess at the very top. You're a London girl coming through at Arsenal. Talk to me about some of those experiences, because at the time, women's football was still. I'm not even sure I can call it an afterthought, but here you were in love with a game that maybe didn't give you the respect or recognition that you deserved. What were some of your earliest experiences like?
Yeah, that's a good point, Shaka. I grew up in northwest London, and I started playing football in my local estate, with the local kids, boys, mostly boys, a little bit at school. Then I got involved with Arsenal when I was about 13, 14 years old, luckily. In those days, the visibility of the women's game really wasn't there. Didn't have those kind of role models that we have today in the women's game on television. So at the time, I thought I was the only girl playing, like every girl in their isolated little place in the country. And then I got to Arsenal, found there was girls football, joined other girls my age and started playing. And then my career kind of just went from there, I suppose. The doors opened. But again, like you say, we were amateurs, training twice a week at the old Highbury and playing games and trying to compete. But it was our passion and my passion that pulled me there. I found my community in the game. And yeah, it was unfortunate that there just wasn't that kind of recognition, as you mentioned earlier, or that support, I guess, on the bigger front in terms of resource.
Do you remember the first paycheck you got for playing football?
Of course I do. I think when I turned 18, I was going through the Centre of Excellence at Arsenal, and Vic Akers, who was my manager at the time, pulled me up to the senior squad and said, we want to sign you on a permanent basis. And that first contract, and I got it in my hand, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And my dad is a big Arsenal fan, so he was ecstatic. He's thinking, he was thinking, I don't have to pay for a petrol anymore or a train ticket, drive her up and down the country. So he was like, he couldn't wait. But really what it was, in those days, it was all the way up as a youth player, you're almost paying to play. You're paying £2-3 just to go to training. And then on top of that, all the travel. But when I got my first contract, it was like £100 an appearance fee, £50 if you got off the bench, But to me, as a teenager, still at home with her parents, it was the first bit of money that I was earning for myself. So I was ecstatic.
It feels so surreal. I remember my own experiences. I signed my first pro contract, and I'm gonna age myself here. September 10th, 1992. I still remember it for the princely sum of £400 a week. And listen, of everything else that's happened since, that date is etched in my memory. I never thought anybody would ever pay me to play football. And then here I was, and so I understand. I understand exactly how you felt, how your dad felt, the sense of pride I'm sure that he had. So you go from Arsenal, and then you join Chelsea from there.
Yeah, so I was really lucky to be part of a very successful team at Arsenal. And I felt like at the time, maybe that was a childish ignorance that I wanted to be challenged a bit more, you know, and experience a different football environment too. So the opportunity came to go to Chelsea, who were trying to develop their squad. And I felt like at the time it was the right thing for me to do, to keep progressing, I suppose, individually. So yeah, I crossed over to the other side of London, which, you know, Dad was not happy.
I feel like that's a whole different conversation there, Anita. So, but you go from Chelsea, you play in the US. I mean, I went to college in the US, so I know the game, and particularly the women's game and the presence that it had here. What were some of the differences you found in coming to the US? Maybe just not in the sporting culture, in your life, the change from, I'm guessing at this point you've lived all of your life in London, be it red or blue half of London, and all of a sudden you're out in the US, a new country. Talk to me about some of the similarities, some of the challenges.
Well, when I was a youngster, actually growing up, the US was held as like the pinnacle, you know, the women's game. When I was a youth player, I heard about players like Mia Hamm. You know, she had this Nike sponsorship, the boots, all of that. So that was the golden temple, was, you know, USA. So when I got the opportunity to go there, was my first experience of being a full-time professional. I'd never had that opportunity to do that in England. So, you know, I got drafted in the discovery round off the back of the World Cup in 2007, went to America. And actually the difference, I would say, was just the level of value and respect towards the women's game, largely because of the success of the US women's national team in major competitions. But the whole kind of operation geared towards the professionalization of the game, you know, having an actual professional league with franchises that were committed to having sort of a competitive game where we had internationals from all over the world playing in it. They wanted the best US players, the best internationals. And for me, that was the first time that I actually got to experience what it would feel like to be training in a team environment on a day-to-day basis and competing for what, you know, was considered the highest level at the time. So that was one of the major differences. It was that kind of level of value and respect towards the women's game.
And it's strange to hear you say, because largely, I certainly by comparison, football, soccer in the US doesn't garner that same respect for the men's or the women's game, and things are a little bit, I wouldn't say totally inverse, just kind of given the presence of the men's game in England and London, where you have so many clubs, and then as you mentioned, in the women's game, you're not even playing professionally. While yes, there was Major League Soccer for the men here in the US, even then it wasn't getting maybe the kind of coverage that it is now. And the women's game certainly seemed to dominate most of the headlines because of the successes of the US women's national team, because of the startup of the league. How did that play out? Just in terms of out in town, your own recognizability.
Yeah, I think you know, there was with every franchise, I think in general in American sport, American culture, there's that very intrinsic link to where you play in that state. You know, New Jersey was where I started off at Sky Blue, New York. So there was that connection to the whole kind of university as well. Rutgers is where we played. Everyone has a strong association with the university. So you had that kind of identification. But actually on a larger scale, I wouldn't say you had the kind of notoriety that you expect from public figures in sport, even then within the women's game, despite the kind of support within the US, ironically. But in contrast to the UK, I think because of the large historical following, you know, in terms of the men's game and the culture of football in England, that was a stark difference to the US, because it feels like the men and the women's game have kind of coexisted simultaneously for a long, a period of time, whereas we've always been sort of playing catch up to that kind of popularity, to the resources in the UK. And obviously policy plays a part in that too, because you take the US college system, where a lot of sports are funneled through, whether the NBA, MLB, whatever it is, they had Title IX, which meant that both, across gender, there was that kind of drive towards equality in terms of the resources at college. And I think that helps spur on the women's game and give the kind of popularity that you're seeing with the household names. When I played there, everyone knew who the American players were. They knew who Heather O'Reilly, Abby Wambach, Megan Rapinoe, Alex Moore. These names, they became household names.
Yeah.
And that was the stark difference compared to that of in the UK.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and I work at ESPN here in the US, and alongside Julie Foudy, who of course is part of the '99 winning team, and yeah, the women's those women really are household names in every aspect of the game here in the US, and I totally understand how that contrasts with playing semi-pro as it were in the time in England, some of the challenges around the women's game, challenges that let's be honest, Anita, you are very vocal about. You always willing to stand up for the game, for what it represents. At times getting you in a little bit of trouble, I guess I can say as nicely as I can. Why did you feel that you had to that this is part of your own responsibilities?
Yeah, I think for me, Shaka, when I was a younger player, I was an introverted person, and I didn't realize the power of sport, as a younger player. But as I got older and experienced more, and I, met more people within the game, I realized just actually the platform that I have and what I can do with it. And one of those ways of doing that was using my voice to, talk about issues that I felt were important to drive the development of the game for me, but both on an individual level, but also collectively. I think the first time I spoke up about something major was on the basis of the Women's World Cup, when they were talking about only playing on turf pitches. And as someone who in 2015, in Canada,
correct. Yeah.
And being a player who prior to that had experienced, injuries like an anterior cruciate ligament injury, knowing the challenges of coming back, trying to play on different surfaces that can be slightly more challenging or problematic, I felt it was important to talk about those issues, and also say we should have equal value in terms of the products that they want to display on a global level. When you're saying that's the highest level, but are we doing the same thing for the men's competitions? Are we saying that they should also play on turf, knowing what the different challenges are? And of course, that can go negatively against you. It didn't. I didn't make that squad. Lots of things happen, but at the same time, that's what it takes when you're trying to push for equality or for the next evolution of our sport. It takes someone to sort of stand above the parapet, as difficult as that may be.
What were you told? What reasons were you given for being left out of that 2015 squad?
Well, for me, actually, obviously there was lots of press coverage and discussions around the turf thing, which was separate to obviously getting selection for my national team. But the way I got told was, I'd been in the national team for 10 plus years, and we'd always had sort of consistent process of what happens towards major tournaments. You get told there'll be a certain date, you'll get a call from your manager to let you know whether you're in the squad or out the squad. Sometimes you'll get a reason, sometimes you won't, but they'll always give you the opportunity at a later date to follow up. And I got called into a camp prior to that tournament that I was involved in, and I got pulled aside spontaneously one day after training by the manager, who just told me there and then that I wasn't selected for the World Cup. So at the time, I took it on the chin, but upon reflection, because I think it took me by surprise, if that makes sense, not because I wasn't selected, but in the way in which that process was handed to me. because in that squad, not one single player was told whether or not they were in or out of the squad at that time. So I got told on an isolated situation where I actually communicated with teammates and said, did that happen for you? Was that the case? Did you have a meeting with the manager, the then manager? And they all said no. So, take that as you will. But at the time, I just felt like, in that particular instance that I was treated differently. And that didn't sit well with me. But at the end of the day, I had to accept what had happened and move on with my club.
Any regrets about being vocal in the way you are and it costing you a place? I'll say it even if you don't want to. Yeah. It costing you a place in the World Cup squad for 2015, because that has been such a debate, particularly over the course of my own career, where players were a little bit slow to speak out at times in fear of that retribution. But now, from the comfort of retirement, and 8 years hindsight to it, do you regret speaking up in the way that you did?
No, I honestly have no regrets, hand on heart, because for me, I'm going to be a mum soon, and I always think of it in this context.
Congratulations!
Thank you very much. I always think of this in this sense. If my child turns to me one day and says there was something monumental happening at a period of time that I was involved in, and said to me, "Oh, Mum, what did you do? How did you feel? What did you say?" I know that I can confidently say, what, I stood with my values and I stood with my principles, and I did what I felt was right for me. And that's not always the easiest thing to do for any individual, especially if you're the person who's being on the other side of it, of course. But for me, that's the one thing I've always tried to do, whether I was on the pitch or off the pitch. Play and be around people and in alignment with my values, and that's what makes me feel good, if that makes sense, in terms of what I contribute in any space that I'm in.
That makes all the sense that is ever needed. I mean, that it is powerful, it is touching, just hearing you speak about motherhood and what that represents and how you want to represent motherhood. It's impactful. Thank you very much for sharing that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've also gone on and you played a couple of seasons in Sweden. Talk to me about. I want to get to understand some of your own experiences as a Black woman playing football in England, where the women's game wasn't respected in the way that it should have been. Going to the US, where the women's game is far higher respected, and then going to Sweden again, into continental Europe, where again, as a Black woman playing football, you have to stand out. And what were some of those experiences? What are some of your experiences as a Black woman in each of those circumstances?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's so many layers to it, I think when I played in England as a youngster, I was around so much diversity in a time where the game wasn't professional. And you have the kind of concept of, football's considered a working class game in Britain and all of those things. But the accessibility in terms of the levels of players was much wider, I feel like, back when I was younger compared to now, when the game has progressed to this professionalization and we're seeing fewer players that look like me at the highest level. And that's a fact, and then I get to, and I've always never felt like the minority, if that makes sense. When I was playing at Arsenal, even from the men's side, that was Arsene Wenger period, lots of Black players, and the men's side, Vieira, all these guys. So when I got Ian Wright and all these guys, so when I got to America, again, I'm thinking New Jersey, New York, from what I understood, quite a diverse state, all of those things. But then, in my team, again, just a trickle, I would say, of our players from various other ethnic minorities. And then I got to understand the bigger picture in the US with related to soccer and like it being more of a middle class, upper class sport, and the college system playing a role in that when it came to education and all the sort of inequalities within that. So then you do really stand out in a sport then that isn't necessarily considered working class or as inclusive, should I say. But the one thing I always felt was that, I did within the game itself, I never felt that I was treated differently or didn't have good connections to the people I worked in and around. But you definitely notice that, when you look out into the crowd, you want to be able to sometimes feel that the atmosphere and the environment is reflective of the society that you represent. And that wasn't always the case. And then there's that element of culture that doesn't always come in, and therefore you get a difference of culture. But when I got to Sweden, of course, I'm in Europe again, but I stood out like a sore thumb because I really was a minority, even more so. So it brings its own challenges on the pitch. It brings the challenges of maybe you wanting to try harder, you wanting to exert yourself more to make sure that you have the best opportunity or chance of playing or getting selected, and those things that sometimes are in and around you subliminally, or what you think is the case, which might not be the case. But in terms of playing, that was never a factor. I found it more in my day-to-day lifestyle. When I go for a coffee with my teammates or something like that, I had random incidences, with like a stranger walking up behind me at a cafe once with my back to him and him just putting his hands in my hair, for example, like a complete stranger, never met, never spoke to, not a single word, touching me.
I'm always amazed by how people feel like that's okay. How is that a thing? Anyway, yeah. Exactly. Go ahead.
No, exactly. So, I was just like, I think my teammates were shocked. I was shocked. I didn't know how to react. I was like, oh, I don't know. Maybe he thought it was, he wanted some tips on my hair or so, I don't know. But like, just bizarre circumstances. And it normally was in my day-to-day, not in my actual football environment. And I think sometimes, obviously, when you get different people from around the world in spaces, sometimes the culture is different. And sometimes the understanding or education isn't there. I had an incident where, a teammate had said something to me, thinking it was in like in jest or camaraderie, and it explained to me, but when I was in my country, I had a teammate who was black like you, and this is how we used to interact and joke, and it was accepted. And I was like, well, it's actually offensive, and you can't reference that word, N-word, whatever, to me or whatever, because we haven't got that relationship, and I don't really advise it in general. So to be fair, I was able to, the situation was handled well. Like she took this on board, she really understood, and I had to really explain that even if you had that relationship with a former teammate, that teammate was likely the minority in your locker room, and felt like they had no choice but to go along with the accepted culture or accepted banter, which is often the language we drop in sports. It's banter. But without really understanding the complexities of that, when you are the only person in the room that finds it, has a problem with it, or has a hard time to voice that it's a problem,
I think that there's also a defining line between accepted and endured or tolerated at an easier level. And as people of color, we often find ourselves in those circumstances where, for I guess, what we may perceive as a greater good, to endure or tolerate traumas, and
not ruffle feathers. Right.
Exactly. And I think that has always been a challenge for us as a community when we find ourselves in spaces where people simply don't look like us, and those people have minimal interaction with people who look like us, and how to understand, respect our space and our respective cultures. I think is one of that has to be one of the bigger takeaways from the conversations that we all have with our peers in today's world. Speaking of which, and speaking of minorities, and again around England football, England women were winning the Euros, but the big criticism around that at England team was its lack of diversity. What did you make of the England team, their performance? What does that victory in the Euros mean for the wider women's game? But then more specifically, how can we get that success or that success have impacts in Black and brown communities for girls who look like you, who want to play the game at that level?
Yeah, I think for me, to see the England women's Euro winning team was a major step in the right direction for the sport as a whole, because I think any successful team in any sport, once you have success, then you can actually push for more change. You somehow acquire a bit more power with the powers that be when you're challenging for new things to develop the game. But of course, I highlighted the issue myself in terms of the lack of diversity in my column. And my point was that, we're all proud of a successful England side if we represent England. But the two things can coexist at the same time. We can still recognize that there are challenges and problems within the sport in terms of the pathways, in terms of acquiring a wider pool of talent across the intersections. And we are losing somehow that, and that might be our blind spot, and that was the only kind of point that I referenced within that as well. But I think it's telling, because we all say when we watch television and we look for our heroes, in different elements, whether that's sport or, kind of actors or whatever, that, I know that my heroes were the Williams sisters in tennis, completely different sport than I participated in, but just their presence, their visibility was very powerful and impactful. And really, the message we're saying is, obviously, with the England team, is the highest representation within our game on an international level. And for those young people to not be able to see anyone reflected in them on the highest stage can be detrimental to the avenues that they seek in order to pursue their passion. So if they see a game which they feel like is not really inviting or inclusive or, representative, they might look at it and go, well, actually, why are there barriers, or what are the barriers to getting there? Is there a way to get there? Can I actually be a player that makes it to the top level of the game? And that's really all we're saying, is that we need to improve the channels so that we can get more, Rachel Yankees, Enio Lucas, myself, Alex Scotts, because we're not seeing them at the moment. And that's a problem for the growth of the game, because football's a global game. We all say that. We say that it brings communities together. It's kind of can be one language, no matter if you speak a common language or not. So how is it possible that we don't have as much representation on the playing field when you actually see a polar opposite in the men's game at the highest level within the England team? It's a very stark contrast.
So what can the English FA do to better develop those channels, those pipelines to get to identify and develop talent in Black and brown communities?
Well, I think that in all fairness and credit to the FA now is that they are acknowledging that there is a problem, and they are now making inroads to try and rectify at least some of the systems in place from a sort of bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach, where the focus has solely been on the top level in terms of the senior national team and all the programs and collaboration within the clubs, with the clubs as well. And I know they have a Discover My Talent campaign that they've now launched, which is allowing anyone within those local communities and grassroots levels to actually put forward names towards the England's pathway systems, to give them the opportunities to maybe get scouted or recruited, into clubs or the system. But I think, by honing in on the resources at the grassroots level, that will go a long way into acquiring more talent, where we don't have in the women's game yet the same kind of consolidated academy system that has existed in the men's game for decades. And we know that we need that process of building to get to that point where we will be able to identify talent in a more sufficient way. But ultimately, it comes down to resources and finances, having the bodies around in terms of coaches and scouts that can actually go around to clubs and go around to grassroots tournaments and actually identify talent. And I think that's probably been one of the discrepancies. But I've also said accessibility. When I was a young player, I played for London clubs. I grew up just outside, in the suburbs of London. And a lot of training grounds are in leafy suburban areas, which are much more challenging for young people to get to, especially young women and girls, when you're training in 8 or 9 o'clock in the countryside with not really great modes of transportation. And it really is basic levels of those sorts of challenges that are going to prohibit young people from getting accessibility, regardless of, where they are and the resources that the club itself have. Because single parent families, all of these challenges, they all play a part.
And now, as a coach with Bristol City Women's, all of this that we've spoken about, you're now trying to manage in one capacity or another, whether we're talking about academies and identifying talent, bringing through talent, representing a community, being an example, the challenges around telling a player that they're not in starting 11 or that they won't be offered a new contract. You're now having to deal with all of that, sometimes at the exact same time. How has that experience been?
Yeah, it's definitely given me a newfound respect for what managers and coaches do, having been on the playing end of it all. It is challenging, of course, because I think as whether you're a player or as a coach, you build these emotional connections to the people you work with on a day-to-day basis, and that's players as well. And you have the challenges of dealing with the contracts and the transfers and all the stuff that goes on within football, whilst trying to tackle the wider issues in the game, which is, of course, inclusion, equality, and all of those things. But I think it's great to be in a space where I'm now within the system a little bit to try and influence those conversations that we have within management from that level, where we can actually have hopefully direct lines of communication to the powers that are either within our club to try and help those processes and try to nullify some of those challenges for the future, because ultimately that's what it's all about. When I got this role, I never thought I'd be coaching initially, but now I'm here. I just hope that other young Black women, other minority groups see me in this role and think, one day I want to work in football, in the game in some capacity, and feel that they have an actual space that they can be in, and that it's about breaking that door down so that it's easier for the next person, and hopefully it will be.
I read somewhere that you're also pursuing a PhD.
Yeah, well, I started my PhD when I was still playing, actually, many years ago. And it was on the governance of women's football, predominantly. So yeah, yet to be completed, but who knows? A lot has happened in those years that I can add more research and information to.
I was about to say we could just say that you're still doing your research. I think that's absolutely right.
100%, and the game has grown so quickly, in a good direction too. So there's so much more that we can actually write about now, I guess, in terms of the growth of the women's game and the game in general.
And what is next for the women's game? How do you see that growth over the next 5 years?
Well, I think ultimately the growth in interest and visibility, the commercial viability of the game will help its development, because it means that the finances can also trickle downwards into those grassroots programs, into making the infrastructure of the game better in all the capacities, in terms of medical, the support that players have, psychology, physiology, all of that, the science that comes into the game can be better across the board. And hopefully the competition will grow, because we've had in the years gone by the dominance of certain clubs, much like in the men's game too at times. But now you get that competition spreading a bit widely, because the economy of the game as a whole is better in the women's game. So players are more willing to move further afield within the UK or abroad, which will make other clubs stronger and more competitive. And hopefully that success will continue, and the interest will continue, and the visibility will grow. But I have to mention, obviously, the Lionesses did say at the end of their success that they wanted to see education and PE have a primary focus on allowing more girls to experience and play football. And I think hopefully that will help that shift in that space too, where the two come aligned as well in the future.
I'm excited just to see how that progression takes shape, see what it looks like, see how the investment continues to impact the women's game in so many ways. Definitely. Anita, I have to say thank you very much for your time. There was a moment during this interview where you stopped me cold, and I don't offer an apology for that. I'm often asked who are my heroes, and I always say my dad. My dad was the example that I needed, was the only example I ever needed. And hearing you speak about motherhood, about being that example to your child, stopped me cold. Thank you very much for that moment. As a parent myself, I have four daughters and a son. Two of my daughters actually play football. So I'll take this moment to also say thank you for being an example to my young Black women who I have in this household. Thanks for being an example to them as well. Nothing you do goes unnoticed. There is no ripple that doesn't have an impact. This has been some conversation. I truly appreciate your time. I truly appreciate everything that you continue to do. And then the father in me wants to say, go on and complete that PhD. complete your research. You get complete your research. I guess as a Caribbean man, we have this value, and having African parents, we have this value around education that we just culturally we just can't shake. No matter what life throws at us, no matter what we're able to accomplish, we always tend to go back to education. So hearing that you started again, it impacted me in ways that you don't know. Thank you very much for that, Anita. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Shaka. Always a pleasure, and you're a true inspiration to me too. So thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.